Karen calls the cops on Democrat man for wearing Harris-WALZ hat, only to discover he's the police chief. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the bustling street. Local shops buzzed with the hum of casual conversation, the clink of cash registers, and the occasional burst of laughter. People milled about, browsing window displays, sipping coffee, and strolling along the sidewalk, each absorbed in their own weekend routines. It was a typical Saturday afternoon, the city's pulse steady and comfortable. Greg Walker, a man in his mid-40s, walked into the cafe at the corner of the street. He'd been a regular here for years, a staple of his weekend routine. The small cafe, known for its artisan coffee and cozy atmosphere, was filled with a mix of regulars and newcomers, all happily absorbed in their own worlds. The barista behind the counter greeted him with a warm smile, and he returned it with his usual easygoing grin. He stepped up to the counter, removed his worn leather jacket, and adjusted the cap on his head, a Harris-WALZ cap. It was simple, unassuming, and as far as he was concerned, just another piece of casual attire. He didn't expect it to attract any attention, especially not in the diverse city he lived in. Little did he know, his choice of hat was about to set off a chain of events that would shake the peaceful Saturday routine. Behind the counter, the barista's smile faltered. She hesitated as her eyes darted to the cap, her expression changing. Greg, oblivious to her shift in demeanor, continued to scan the chalkboard menu above her head. "Can I get a large black coffee, please?" he asked, not noticing the slight tension in her posture. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she gave a pointed glance at the other employees nearby, exchanging silent communication. After what seemed like a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice carefully controlled but unmistakably firm. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Greg blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" Her tone remained cold, though her words were sharp. "You're wearing a political statement, and we don't allow that here. It's against our policy." He frowned, looking around at the casual, relaxed atmosphere of the cafe. "A political statement? It's just a hat." The barista's eyes narrowed slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I'm sorry, but we can't have that kind of thing in here. You'll have to leave." Greg's frown deepened. He wasn't sure if she was joking or if something had gotten lost in translation, but her tone brooked no argument. "Wait a second, are you serious? This is just a hat. It's not like I'm doing anything wrong." The other baristas, who had been busy preparing orders just moments before, were now watching intently, their gazes flicking between Greg and the barista in a mix of confusion and curiosity. Some exchanged glances, but no one spoke up. The tension in the air was palpable. "I'm afraid it's not just a hat," she replied, crossing her arms over her chest, standing her ground. "It's a political statement. We've had complaints about these kinds of things before, and we can't risk upsetting our customers." Greg shook his head, his mind spinning with disbelief. "Are you kidding me? It's just a cap with a name on it. I'm here to grab coffee, not cause a scene." He tried to take a step forward, but the barista held up her hand, her fingers splayed wide in a clear gesture of finality. "I'm sorry, sir. You'll have to leave now." Greg stood frozen, trying to process what had just happened. This was the kind of thing that was supposed to happen in some far-off place, not here, not in his hometown. Was he really being asked to leave a cafe for wearing a hat? "This is ridiculous," Greg muttered, feeling his frustration building. He was just trying to enjoy a peaceful Saturday afternoon, and now this? He couldn't understand how something so small had become such an issue. The barista continued to stare him down, her expression unwavering. "Please leave." Greg exhaled sharply, feeling his temper rise. He could sense the other customers watching, some with raised eyebrows, others whispering behind their hands. It was as if they were all waiting for him to either make a scene or back down. But something in Greg snapped. "Fine," he said, finally stepping back, his voice tight with anger. "I'll leave, but you have no idea who you're dealing with. This isn't the last you'll hear of this." The barista didn't respond, instead turning her back to him as if dismissing him completely. Greg paused for a moment, looking around the cafe. He wasn't the only one there. Yet none of the other customers spoke up. The silence in the air seemed to confirm everything. They were waiting for him to leave, waiting for the drama to die down. Greg felt a small spark of anger as he turned and made his way out the door. He had been wronged, that much was clear, and he wasn't going to let this go. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, he was determined to find out why a simple hat had caused such a ruckus. The situation was escalating in ways he hadn't anticipated. But no matter what it took, Greg was going to get to the bottom of this. He wasn't some random guy. He wasn't just anyone. And he was about to make sure they knew that. Greg stepped out onto the sidewalk, his mind racing. The cool air of the afternoon hit his face, but it did little to calm the fire that had been sparked in him. He had been publicly humiliated for something as simple as a hat, something as harmless as a piece of clothing. As he walked along the street, his thoughts began to gather, forming a plan. This couldn't just be swept under the rug. He wasn't going to let some barista decide how he should express himself. The cafe door swung shut behind him with a soft chime, and he found himself standing in front of the cafe. He stood there for a moment, taking in the situation. The quiet hum of the street seemed to mock him. Everything felt normal, too normal. People were still walking by, some laughing, some chatting, unaware of what had just transpired. Greg was fuming, but it was that controlled anger, the kind that built up inside and pushed you to take action. He pulled out his phone, quickly dialing the number of the cafe's corporate office. There had to be a better way to handle something like this. As he waited for someone to pick up, he turned around and glared at the cafe. What was it about this hat? Why had it triggered such a reaction? The phone rang for a few moments before someone picked up, their voice professional and uninterested. "Good afternoon. How may I assist you?" Greg's voice was tight, his anger barely controlled. "I just left your cafe at address, and I was asked to leave because of my hat." There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a click of keys. "I'm sorry to hear that, sir. Could you please clarify which hat you were wearing?" "A Harris-WALZ hat," Greg said, annoyed. "You can look up what it means, but it's not an offensive thing. It's a campaign hat. I wasn't bothering anyone." "I see," the voice responded. "I will file a report and our team will review it. I'm afraid I cannot do much about it right now. I'll escalate the issue, and someone will be in touch." Greg seethed. It wasn't enough. A report? A review? He needed more. He had been embarrassed, treated like a criminal for simply wearing a piece of clothing. The anger in him was growing, now a full-blown fire. This isn't about a report. This is about a policy, about your staff making assumptions. What exactly are they teaching your employees? The woman on the other end stuttered a bit before responding. "Sir, please understand that our staff is only doing their jobs. They are trained to ensure that all of our customers feel comfortable." Greg's patience was wearing thin. "Comfortable?" he scoffed. "I've been coming to this cafe for years. I've spent hundreds of dollars here, and now I'm supposed to feel like I'm a threat because of a damn hat." There was a short silence on the other end before the woman spoke again. "I understand your frustration, but please understand that the matter is being taken seriously. I will make sure this is addressed with our management team. Is there anything else I can do for you?" Greg slammed his hand against the building's brick wall. "Yeah, you can let your manager know that this isn't over. I'm not done with this. Not by a long shot." The line went quiet, but he didn't care. He wasn't looking for an apology, not from them. What he needed was an explanation, something more than a corporate apology, and we'll look into it. This wasn't the way it was supposed to work. A simple mistake, a simple misunderstanding, shouldn't have escalated to this. The barista had acted like she had the power to decide what was acceptable. And now, here he was being dismissed by corporate. Greg gritted his teeth. If they wouldn't act on it, he'd have to make them. He would go directly to the source, find out who owned this franchise, and make them understand what had happened. If they thought they could treat their customers like this, they were mistaken. But as he walked down the street, ready to take the next step in his escalating plan, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was brewing. It wasn't just about the cafe or the hat anymore. It was about principle. The streets were still filled with people, and some eyed him as they passed, no doubt curious about the anger that seemed to hang in the air around him. He wasn't just a guy venting anymore. He was on a mission. Greg's eyes narrowed. He could hear the faint clink of keys as a car approached. Without realizing it, he was now standing in front of the cafe again, his fists clenched by his side. His thoughts were a whirlwind. The same words he had spoken to the corporate office ringing in his ears. They had treated him like a threat, like a criminal. His actions weren't just about getting an apology anymore. They were about making sure no one else ever felt the way he had. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. This was about making a statement, about setting things right. But what was the right way to go about it? He wasn't sure yet. He needed to make sure this mistake wasn't forgotten, that it wasn't brushed aside by another customer complaint filed into the company's pile of customer feedback. And then it hit him, the manager. He needed to get in touch with whoever was in charge of the cafe, whoever was responsible for training their employees and setting policies, whoever thought it was okay to decide who belonged in the cafe based on a hat. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a notification, a comment on one of his social media posts from a while ago. It read, "I don't care what your hat means. You shouldn't bring politics into public places." Greg's jaw clenched. The comment wasn't from someone he knew. In fact, it looked like another stranger had taken to his page to criticize him, someone who had no idea what he stood for. The nerve of it. It didn't matter what he wore, and it sure didn't matter what someone else thought. Greg took a deep breath, his anger only growing. This wasn't going away, and it wasn't over yet. Greg stood on the sidewalk for a few moments, staring at the front of the cafe, his mind swirling with thoughts of what had just happened. His face burned with frustration as the sounds of the city continued around him, but he was oblivious to it all. All he could focus on was the interaction with the barista, the way she had treated him, the way she had assumed he was something that he was not just because of a hat. His phone buzzed in his pocket again, and he pulled it out quickly, hoping for a distraction. It was a message from one of his friends. Greg's finger hovered over the screen for a moment, but he hesitated. No, this wasn't the time for small talk. Not when he had been wronged like this. Not when he had been humiliated in public by someone who didn't even know him. He typed out a quick response anyway. Just dealt with some nonsense at the cafe. The barista kicked me out because of my hat. I'm done with it. He hit send before even thinking about what it meant. Was he done? Could he just walk away and forget it happened? No, that wasn't who he was. He had to make sure this kind of thing didn't happen again, not just to him but to anyone else who might face the same kind of treatment. His phone buzzed again, but he didn't even glance at the message. His feet moved on their own, and before he knew it, he was standing at the door of the cafe again. He felt an overwhelming surge of anger, something that burned deep in his chest. The kind of anger that pushed him to take action, to make sure people knew they couldn't get away with this kind of behavior. Not on his watch. Greg pushed open the door, the little bell above it ringing as he stepped inside. The cafe was bustling with activity, the noise of chatter and the clinking of cups filling the air. But none of that mattered to him right now. What mattered was getting this resolved. What mattered was showing them that he wasn't going to back down. He made his way to the counter, his eyes scanning the room for the barista who had kicked him out. There she was, standing behind the counter, chatting with another employee, completely oblivious to the storm that was coming her way. Greg walked right up to the counter, slamming his hand down on it with force. The sound of his palm hitting the wood was enough to make the barista jump, and she looked up, her eyes widening as she saw him standing there. Her expression quickly changed from casual indifference to a look of mild concern, but it didn't last long. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice sounding somewhat bored. Greg leaned forward, his fists clenched by his sides. "Yeah, you can help me," he said, his voice tight with anger. "I need an explanation for what happened earlier." The barista blinked, clearly caught off guard by his directness. She glanced at the other employee for support, but when she saw the determined look in Greg's eyes, she turned back to him. "I already told you, sir, we can't allow that kind of political statement in here. It makes people uncomfortable." Greg could feel the blood rushing to his face. his heart pounding in his chest. He took a deep breath, trying to keep himself calm. Uncomfortable? He repeated, his voice rising. What about my comfort? You just kicked me out because of a hat. A hat that doesn't even mean what you think it means. And now you're telling me I'm the problem. The barista's eyes flicked nervously between Greg and her coworker, but she didn't answer. She crossed her arms defensively, standing her ground, but Greg could see the uncertainty in her posture. She knew she was in the wrong, but she wasn't going to admit it. Not yet. You're not the first person who's complained about that hat, she said after a long pause. There have been other customers who felt the same way. We have to make sure this is a safe space for everyone. Greg's eyes narrowed, and he stepped closer to the counter. A safe space, he scoffed. You're the one who's making people uncomfortable by assuming that just because someone wears a certain hat, they're a threat. It's called freedom of expression. But I guess that's a concept you don't understand. The barista bristled at his words, her face reddening. You don't know anything about me, she snapped, her voice growing louder. You don't know what I've had to deal with. People like you don't get to come in here and dictate what's acceptable. You want to wear that hat, fine. But not here. Not in my cafe. Greg was taken aback by the venom in her words, but he didn't flinch. He didn't back down. People like me? He asked, his voice now dripping with sarcasm. I'm just a guy trying to get a cup of coffee. I'm not the one with a problem. But you've got a serious problem. You're making this whole place uncomfortable. The other employees were watching now, unsure whether to intervene. The tension between Greg and the barista was palpable, and still the barista refused to budge. She wasn't willing to acknowledge that she might have overstepped her bounds. In her mind, she was right, and anyone who disagreed with her was in the wrong. Greg looked around the cafe, taking in the awkward silence that had descended over the room. The customers at the tables seemed to be looking at their phones or pretending not to notice, but he could feel their eyes on him. They knew something was happening, something that wasn't quite right. And for the first time, Greg realized it wasn't just about him anymore. This was about standing up for what was right. The barista, however, wasn't ready to let go of her position. I'm sorry, but that's the way it is, she said, her tone cold. You can leave now. Greg looked at her, his jaw tightening. He was done playing by her rules. He wasn't going anywhere until he got what he came for. But before he could say anything more, the sound of the cafe door opening interrupted their confrontation. The barista stared at Greg, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, defiance flashing in her eyes. There was something almost familiar about her stance, like she had dealt with confrontations like this before and had come out on top. Her face remained expressionless, though the tension in the air was palpable. A small crowd had gathered at the edge of the counter, a few people now noticing the standoff and observing it as if it were a scene from a show. You can stand there all you want, the barista said, her voice a little shaky but trying to maintain control. But that doesn't change anything. We don't serve people like you. People who come in here thinking they can wear a hat like that and get away with it. Greg's patience, already thin, was beginning to wear even thinner. The injustice of the entire situation swirled in his mind. This woman had no right to treat him this way. He hadn't done anything wrong, not really. He was just wearing a hat, an item of clothing that represented his personal belief, not a weapon of hate or violence. And yet, here she was, accusing him of things that weren't true. I'm not a criminal for wearing a hat, Greg replied, his voice growing more exasperated with each word. What exactly is it that you think is so wrong with this hat? What is so offensive about it? The barista scoffed, rolling her eyes dramatically as she glanced around the room. It's not about the hat, okay? It's about what it represents. You're walking around with that thing on your head like it's some kind of badge of honor. You're advertising division. You're advertising hate. Greg felt his fists clenching at his sides, but he refused to let himself escalate further. He wasn't here to argue politics. He was here for coffee, something simple, but she had to make it political. She had to take it to a place he hadn't expected. That's your opinion, Greg said flatly, and you're entitled to it. But it doesn't give you the right to treat me like I'm some criminal just because I'm wearing a hat that makes you uncomfortable. The words hit the barista harder than Greg had anticipated. Her eyes flashed with anger, and she opened her mouth to retort. But Greg interrupted her before she could speak. "I'm a paying customer, just like everyone else in this place," he continued. "And I'm not going to stand here while you make assumptions about me based on what I'm wearing. This is ridiculous." The barista took a deep breath, visibly seething with frustration. "You're not the first person to come in here and try to cause a scene with that hat," she spat. "It's people like you who make this place uncomfortable. You want to wear that thing, fine, but don't expect us to treat you like everyone else. You're not." Greg's jaw clenched, the unfairness of it all gnawing at him. It wasn't about the hat. It wasn't about any of the things she had accused him of. It was about her being uncomfortable, about her imposing her discomfort on him, trying to turn it into something larger than it was. It was unfair. He wasn't going to let it slide. The crowd was growing now, more people walking in, glancing over their shoulders to witness the heated confrontation. Greg could feel the weight of their gazes, but he couldn't bring himself to care. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when it mattered most. "You don't get it, do you?" the barista asked, her voice trembling with frustration. "You're part of the problem. People like you don't understand what it's like for people like me. I'm just trying to make this place a safe space. A place where everyone can feel comfortable. And you," she jabbed a finger in his direction, her expression growing more bitter by the second. "You just waltz in here, pushing your agenda, making everything harder. Do you understand that?" Greg couldn't believe what he was hearing. The sheer audacity of her words was mind-boggling. "You think I'm the problem?" he said slowly, his voice growing cold. "I'm just here for coffee. I didn't come here to argue. I didn't come here to offend anyone. But you," he shook his head, disbelief still written across his face. "You decided to take it to another level." The barista's eyes narrowed, and her hands shook slightly at her sides. "You've crossed a line," she said, the words hanging in the air between them. "You're not welcome here. Not with that hat. You need to leave." Greg stood there for a moment, letting her words sink in. Was she really telling him to leave? Telling him to leave a place that he had every right to be, every right to enjoy? His anger boiled inside of him, but he held back. There was no point in escalating things further. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a scene. "I'm not leaving," Greg said, his voice steady now. "Not until I get what I came for. And that's a coffee. Just a regular coffee. No politics. No drama." The barista opened her mouth to speak again, but before she could, a figure appeared from behind the counter. It was another employee, someone who had been watching the entire exchange with a mixture of concern and confusion. She hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice quiet but firm. "Is everything all right?" she asked, clearly unsure of how to intervene without making things worse. "Can I help you with something?" Greg glanced at her, noticing the genuine concern in her eyes. He knew she was trying to defuse the situation, but the barista wasn't having it. "No," the barista snapped, her hand waving in the air dismissively. "This man doesn't get to dictate what's acceptable in here. Not with that hat." The second employee's face tightened with a mixture of discomfort and surprise, and she glanced at Greg before looking back at the barista. "Maybe we should just cool down and talk this through," she suggested, her tone tentative, but the barista shook her head, crossing her arms tightly. "No, he needs to leave. Now." Greg stood his ground, his eyes fixed on the barista, unwilling to back down. "I'm not leaving without my coffee," he said, his tone resolute. "If you don't want to serve me, fine, but I'm not leaving empty-handed. You can't treat people like this." The barista stared him down, the silence stretching between them, before she spoke again, her voice harsh and angry. "Fine. You want your coffee," she said, the words barely masking her disdain. "You'll get it. But don't think this is over." Greg could feel the heat rising in his chest, an uncomfortable mixture of anger and frustration. He hadn't expected his simple visit for a coffee to turn into a full-on confrontation. But here they were, him and this barista, locked in a battle of wills. And he wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when he knew he was in the right. "Are you done?" The barista snapped, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Because I'm not going to stand here and waste my time on someone like you, wearing that ridiculous hat, thinking you can get away with it. You think this is just some game." Greg exhaled through his nose, trying to keep his emotions in check. He could feel the stares of the other customers, their eyes on him like vultures, and the last thing he wanted to do was cause a scene. But the barista was making it impossible to avoid. "No, I don't think this is a game," Greg replied, his voice growing colder with each passing moment. "You're the one turning it into something bigger than it needs to be. I came here for coffee, just coffee. But now you've made it about something else entirely. You're making it about your own discomfort." The barista glared at him, her jaw tightening. "You really don't get it, do you?" she said, stepping closer to the counter, as if trying to assert some kind of dominance over him. "It's not just about being uncomfortable. It's about what that hat stands for, what it represents. You don't get to waltz in here and think you can just parade that crap around like it's normal." Greg stared at her, the disbelief written all over his face. "You think that just because I'm wearing a hat, I'm doing something wrong? You think that gives you the right to treat me like this? I'm just here for coffee. I'm not hurting anyone." Her voice rose, filled with righteous indignation. "It's not about the hat itself, you idiot. It's about the message you're sending. You think you can walk around like that and not expect consequences? You think you can just flaunt your beliefs and think everyone's going to be okay with it?" Greg was shaking his head, unable to believe the words coming out of her mouth. "I don't need to apologize for what I believe in. I'm not the one causing a scene here. You are. You're the one making it about politics. You're the one judging me based on what I'm wearing." The barista took another step forward, leaning slightly over the counter, as if trying to intimidate him. "You think you can just wear that hat and everything will be fine? Well, it's not. Not in my store. Not on my watch." Greg's anger was quickly turning into something else now. Something colder. He could feel the energy shifting in the room. The atmosphere had become charged, tense, and the crowd that had gathered was only making it worse. Every eye was on him, waiting for something to happen, waiting for him to either back down or escalate. "Do you always treat customers like this?" Greg asked, his voice now sharp, biting. "Or am I just special because I'm wearing a hat you don't like?" The barista flinched, but quickly recovered. She shook her head, refusing to show any sign of weakness. "You're not special," she sneered, "but you're definitely not welcome here. Not with that hat. Not with your attitude." Greg's patience was quickly evaporating. He was done with this. Done with her rude behavior, her assumptions, her entire attitude. This wasn't just about the hat anymore. This was about someone feeling entitled enough to treat another person like dirt for no reason other than their own prejudice. "You don't get to decide who's welcome and who's not," Greg said coldly. "I'm a paying customer, just like everyone else in here, and I'm not going anywhere. If you've got a problem with that, maybe you should go take it up with your manager." The barista's face turned red, and for a moment, Greg thought she might explode. But instead, she just slammed her hand down on the counter, her fingers digging into the wood, her frustration palpable. "Don't tell me what to do," she shouted, her voice cracking. "I'm the one in charge here, and I'm telling you, you need to leave. Now, if you don't, I'll have you escorted out." "Go ahead," he said, his voice steady but tinged with something dangerous. "Call whoever you need to, but I'm not going anywhere until I get my coffee. And if you think you can make me leave just because you don't like my hat, then you've got another thing coming." Her eyes burned with anger, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached for her phone behind the counter, her fingers trembling slightly. The tension in the room thickened as she began to dial the number, her gaze flicking between Greg and the phone, as though trying to muster the courage to escalate things further. Greg stood his ground, watching her every move. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he refused to let her see his uncertainty. He wasn't backing down. "This is ridiculous," the barista muttered to herself, her voice just loud enough for Greg to hear. You think you can just walk in here, making a scene like this, wearing that hat, and expect me to just serve you like everyone else? Greg couldn't take it anymore. The anger, the frustration, the unfairness. It was all too much. He had been patient long enough, and he was done playing her game. If you really want to make this into something bigger, he said, his tone cold and measured, then let's make it big. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not leaving until you get it through your head. You don't get to treat people like this. Fine, she spat, slamming the phone down. Have it your way, but you're not going to like the consequences. The barista's grip on the phone tightened as she stared at Greg. Her eyes narrowed with contempt. For a moment, she seemed to reconsider, but her pride quickly overtook her. She wasn't about to let this customer, this man in the ridiculous hat, get the best of her. I'm done with this, she muttered under her breath, though loud enough for Greg to hear. She stood tall, as if to project dominance, trying to make him feel small in front of the growing crowd. You don't get to walk in here and disrespect me or my cafe. You're making a spectacle of yourself, and I won't have it. Greg's posture remained calm, but internally, a storm was brewing. He had never expected to be treated like this, and he wasn't about to back down now. His voice, though measured, carried an edge that cut through the tension. You're the one who's making a scene here. All I wanted was coffee, but you turned it into something much bigger. You're not just making this personal. You're making it political. Her face flushed a bright red. She took a step forward, leaning across the counter, her finger pointing directly at him as though she were chastising a child. That's exactly the point, she spat, venom dripping from her words. You come in here with that hat on, and you think everyone should just be okay with it? I'm not going to serve someone who's openly supporting that man, that party. You're a disgrace. The crowd watching the exchange was growing, whispers rippling through the air, people craning their necks to see what would happen next. Some looked on in quiet judgment, others unsure whether to intervene. But no one spoke up, no one but Greg. He couldn't stay silent any longer. Your personal issues aren't my responsibility, Greg shot back, his voice steady but unyielding. I'm here to get a coffee. That's it. I'm not here to get your opinion on who I'm voting for, or why I wear what I wear, but the way you're treating me. This is your issue, not mine. The barista slammed her palm onto the counter with a force that made the other customers flinch. Her face twisted in disgust as she seethed. You think you can just waltz around with that hat like it's normal? You think the rest of us should just sit idly by while you shove your views down our throats? That's the problem with people like you. You don't care how your actions affect others. You don't care how I feel. Greg wasn't fazed. He'd dealt with this before, this kind of misplaced outrage, this kind of entitled attitude from people who thought they could dictate who should belong and who shouldn't based on arbitrary standards. He took a deep breath, readying himself for the final part of this exchange. Listen, I don't know what your problem is with my hat, he said, his tone still calm but cutting through her anger. But I'm not the one with the issue here. I'm not the one treating people like dirt just because of their beliefs. That's all on you. Her lips trembled, not in fear, but in rage. She could feel the crowd's eyes on her, but she refused to be the one to back down. She wasn't going to let him have the last word. She wasn't going to let him make her look weak in front of these people. Get out, she barked, pointing toward the door. I've had enough of your attitude. You're not welcome here. I'm not serving you, and I'm not going to tolerate your behavior. But Greg wasn't moving. He stood there, unaffected by her outbursts. You're not in a position to tell me what I can and can't do. I'm here as a paying customer. And you, he paused, a flash of realization hitting him. You work for me. The words hung in the air like a bombshell, and for the first time in their conversation, the barista froze, her expression faltering. What did you just say? She stammered, her face suddenly pale, the anger draining from her expression for a brief moment. I said, Greg repeated slowly, with deliberate clarity, you work for me. The realization seemed to hit her like a ton of bricks, but she quickly tried to regain control, her hands shaking with the effort. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, her voice faltering. You don't own this place. Greg let out a short, humorless laugh. I do. I'm the owner. I've been running this cafe for years. I'm the one who makes the decisions around here. You're just the barista who got caught up in your own prejudices." The crowd stood in stunned silence. The barista's mouth moved, but no words came out. She blinked several times, trying to process what he was saying. For a moment, she looked like she might collapse under the weight of the truth. "You, what?" she stammered again, clearly struggling to regain her composure. Greg took a step closer to the counter, not with anger, but with cold resolve. "You called me out for wearing my hat. You thought you could treat me however you wanted because of it. But now, I'm telling you, you've crossed a line, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." Her face was now a mixture of disbelief and humiliation. She had no idea who she was dealing with when she'd first opened her mouth, but now, the truth was staring her right in the face. The last shred of her arrogance melted away, replaced by confusion and regret. But it was too late for that now. She looked to the people around her, but no one stepped forward to defend her. The entire cafe, previously tense and divided, was now filled with an awkward silence. No one wanted to speak up. No one wanted to be the one caught on the wrong side of this revelation. Greg, however, wasn't finished yet. He wasn't here to make peace. He was here to set things straight. And as far as he was concerned, the lesson was far from over. "You're going to learn something today," he said, his voice clear and final. "You don't get to treat people like that. Not in my cafe. Not ever." The barista stood there, her face flushed, her pride shattered. But still, she refused to admit her wrong. It was clear she wasn't going to apologize, and Greg wasn't asking for one. But the damage was done. The people in the cafe had seen it all. They had seen her humiliation, and they had heard him call her out for it. It was all that mattered. The barista stood frozen behind the counter, her face pale as the realization of what had just happened hit her. The room had gone eerily silent, everyone now watching, waiting for her response. But she had none. She was standing on the edge of a precipice, and Greg wasn't about to let her step back from it. Greg's gaze locked onto hers, calm yet unwavering. "You wanted to make a scene," he said coldly, "but you've made your own mess now, and there's no one here to clean it up but you." A moment of silence stretched on, but the tension in the room was palpable. The barista opened her mouth to say something, but no words came. Her earlier anger had dissolved, replaced by a growing realization that her position had become untenable. Her pride was gone, her control over the situation completely stripped away. She had wanted to be in charge, to assert dominance, but now she had become the spectacle. Greg took a step back, his voice gaining authority with each word. "You thought you could push me around, that you could shame me for wearing my hat. You thought you could manipulate your position to control who's allowed to be here, who's allowed to feel comfortable, and who isn't. Well, now the truth's out. You've shown your true colors." The barista's face flushed a deep shade of red, a mixture of anger and embarrassment. She opened her mouth again, but the words felt stuck in her throat. It was like she was trapped in her own silence, unable to speak because the weight of her actions had finally caught up with her. "Did you really think you could get away with it?" Greg continued, his tone unwavering. "That you could treat people however you wanted, just because they don't share your views? Just because they're different?" One by one, the customers in the cafe began to shift uncomfortably. A few of them exchanged glances, clearly stunned by the way she had been exposed. Greg's words had landed. No one in the cafe was on her side anymore. She was completely alone in this. The barista finally found her voice, but it was weak, shaky. I didn't mean to. No, Greg interrupted, his voice sharp. "You meant every word. You just didn't think you'd get caught. You didn't think your own attitude would come back to bite you. And now it has. And it's too late for apologies." The crowd that had gathered around had begun to whisper, their eyes fixed on the barista. She was no longer a symbol of power in that cafe. She was the person everyone would remember for this mistake. She had turned herself into the villain of the story, and no amount of backpedaling would change that. Greg's eyes didn't leave hers, not even for a second. He wasn't angry. He was beyond that, This wasn't about getting revenge. It was about setting a boundary, making it clear that actions have consequences. And in this case, the consequences were inevitable. "You're not going to win people over by being a bully," Greg said, his voice now more of a lesson than an accusation. "And you're sure as hell not going to win my respect. You've treated a paying customer like garbage just because of a hat. Because of a symbol that means something to me." The barista's hands were trembling now. She was no longer the confident figure she had once been. Her anger had dissolved, replaced by something she didn't want to face. Shame. She had built herself up to be someone who could control others, someone who could decide who was allowed to be in the cafe and who wasn't. But now all she had left was her failure. Greg turned toward the rest of the cafe, addressing the crowd with a calm, decisive air. "Let this be a lesson," he said. "You don't get to treat people like this. You don't get to decide who deserves respect and who doesn't based on something as shallow as a hat or a political belief." The barista's eyes welled up with tears, but she didn't dare wipe them away. She had lost this battle, and Greg wasn't giving her the luxury of feeling sorry for herself. She wasn't the victim here. She was the aggressor. "Maybe it's time to learn some humility," Greg added, his words like a final blow. "Maybe it's time to understand that treating people with respect isn't about agreeing with them. It's about being human." The rest of the customers in the cafe were now looking at the barista with a mixture of pity and judgment. She had exposed herself for what she truly was. A person willing to disrespect and belittle someone just because of a political stance, unwilling to listen, unwilling to see beyond her own biases. Greg turned his back to her, knowing that his work here was done. "I'm done," he said firmly, "but I expect the rest of you to treat people better than this." Without another word, he walked out of the cafe, leaving the barista standing there, alone in the fallout of her own actions. The crowd dispersed slowly, some still exchanging whispers, some casting a final glance at the woman who had failed her own test of integrity. But the damage had been done. There was no redemption for her. The lesson had been taught, not through kindness, but through the undeniable consequences of her own arrogance. And the truth of the matter was, she would have to live with that for a long time. We've all been there, right? Maybe not in the exact same situation, but we've all witnessed that moment when someone, driven by arrogance and misplaced authority, tries to put someone down. Maybe you've been the one caught up in an argument over something as simple as a hat, or a t-shirt, or even a political statement, only for it to spiral into something far uglier. It happens, and more often than we'd like to admit, people like the barista in this story think they can get away with it. But here's the thing, actions always speak louder than words. You might think you're in control, maybe even justify your actions as right in the moment, but it's only when you push someone too far that the truth reveals itself. Just like the barista who tried to tear down Greg for wearing a simple hat, she thought she was above reproach, that her opinions mattered more than someone else's. But in reality, her assumptions were just an armor of ignorance. She didn't know Greg's story, and she certainly didn't understand the power of her own prejudices. We often find ourselves in situations where we judge someone based on appearance, whether it's a political hat, a t-shirt, or simply the way they speak. But when that judgment turns into an attack, that's when things start to break down. It's not just about disagreeing anymore. It's about a loss of respect, a failure to see the humanity in someone who doesn't share our views. It's this lack of empathy that creates division and fosters conflict. It's not just a difference of opinion, it becomes a clash of egos, of power. The moment you believe you're better than someone else because of their beliefs or what they wear is the moment you've lost your moral high ground. The twist, the turning point, the gotcha moment, happens when the barista's misplaced arrogance finally crumbles. She thought she could push Greg around, shame him, and control the situation because of his hat. Little did she know, her assumptions were not just wrong, they were dangerous. She had no idea who Greg really was, who he represented, or the weight his presence carried. But Greg, the person she tried to humiliate, was the very person who could turn her world upside down. When we think we're right, it's easy to fall into the trap of attacking someone else, trying to show that our opinions are superior. But in Greg's case, the truth was clear. He wasn't the one in the wrong. He didn't need to shout or fight back in the traditional sense. He didn't need to lower himself to her level. All he needed was the truth, and that truth was enough to tear down her facade. He didn't yell, didn't argue further. He just stood tall, presented the facts, and let her actions speak for themselves. And let's be honest, there's something satisfying about seeing someone like the barista, who thought they had all the power, fall from their high horse. She was quick to judge, but slow to understand. In the end, her prejudice was her downfall. And in the process, Greg didn't just defend his own dignity. He defended the dignity of everyone who's ever been underestimated or unfairly treated. This isn't just about a political difference or wearing a specific hat. It's about respect. It's about holding onto the fundamental idea that we don't get to treat others poorly just because they're different. What Greg did was simple but effective. He showed that the truth and dignity can bring down those who try to tear others apart based on their own biases. So here's a question for all of us. How often do we allow our own biases to control our actions? How often do we assume we're right, simply because someone is different or wears something we don't agree with? And when we do, what happens when we get it wrong? Because we all know, sometimes the lesson comes when you least expect it. The next time you find yourself in a situation where you're ready to judge, stop for a second and remember Greg's story. Don't be the one tearing someone else down. And when someone tries to make you feel small, don't fight back with anger. Fight back with the truth. It's the one weapon that no one can take from you.